What's going on, guys? Ryan Nelson here, and today I wanted to share with you my thoughts on the Sony A7R III compared to the Canon EOS R camera. Now, I was fortunate enough to have to shoot an event that was sponsored by Sony, so they did send me this camera to shoot that event. They sent it to me a little bit ahead of time so I could get used to it, learn how to use it. Since I'm not really a Sony shooter, I needed that little bit of time to get used to this camera. I've spent the better part of the last week shooting mainly on the Sony A7R III, but I did have a chance here and there to pull out the EOS R to do some comparison shots. I just wanted to share my thoughts with you on using both of these two cameras, how they compare, how the quality compares. So let's dive right into it and let me show you what I got. To start off, I'm shooting a 24-70 2.8 on both of these cameras for all of these comparisons. So on each of these comparison shots, I did my best to get the exact same focal length. I did all the same settings just to kind of get that comparison as close as possible, even though these are two very different cameras. Now, the first thing I did notice when I started using this Sony is just the finger distance that you really don't have right here, especially on this 24-70 lens. I did notice on a couple other lenses it was really tight in there too, and I have tiny little digits. I don't have big hands, and it's still a little tight in there. Versus the Canon EOS R, where I have a fair amount of room. Can you see that? Can you see that? Right there. I have a fair amount of room right there. Pick up the Sony, I'm already hitting the lens. Other than that, they're both about the same weight, feel about the same size of my hand. Now, I know these are two very different cameras. This is a very high resolution camera. It's over 40 megapixels as to where the Canon is just over 30 megapixels. That's a lot of megapixels. No matter how you look at it, that's a lot. That's enough for almost anything you're gonna do. So, very high resolution on both of these. Sony's definitely a bit higher, so you're gonna have a little bit more wiggle room when cropping your images later on. And if you're into high-speed shooting, the Sony does 10 frames a second, EOS R does 8 frames a second. If you want to use this for video, the Sony might even have a little edge here. It does 120 frames a second, the super slow motion in 1080, as to where the Canon EOS R only does 120 frames per second at 720. You can scale it up to 1080, it still comes out pretty good, but we'll see how that scales compared to just shooting it at 1080 and being done with it. You know, I shoot 4K. Canon has a little bit of a crop sensor, but I actually found out when I was shooting, so does the Sony. So Sony guys, what's up with that? I always hear, oh, but Canon has a crop sensor in 4K. Guess what? So did this. So did this. I noticed maybe not as much as the Canon, but it still cropped a little bit. To be honest with you, I actually like the crop because that gives me a little bit more flexibility in my lenses. So both do 4K 30, 1080 60, and 120 frames per second. 720 and 1080. Now, if you want to use an external recorder, say something like the Atomos Ninja 5, nice little recorder, you can export 422 10-bit from the Canon EOS R. As to where on the Sony, if you're recording externally, you can still do 422, but it's only 8-bit, not 10-bit, so there's a little bit of loss there. Now, one of the first features that I found in the Sony that I know for a fact is not in the Canon, and I really wish it was, is a time-lapse function. Now, this is an update on the newest firmware for the A7 III and the A7R III. I'll link to a video up here on how to set that up really easy. So that being said, I did a time-lapse comparison, so let's dive right in and take a look at those. So as we take a look at these time lapses, you can definitely see a little bit of a color difference in both. Well, you can definitely see a little bit of lens flare difference in both of these. Both of these cameras do start to get a little bit noisy towards the end, maybe a little bit less on the Canon. And looking at the second example, Sony does look a little janky, but that's more to do with the wind and my setup. See this? See this setup? It wasn't the best, but it's what I had. Anyway, back to the time lapse. Again, both of these do start to get a little bit noisy towards the end. Now, since these were photo time lapses, I wanted to pick out a few frames and compare them more or less side by side. So let's take a look at that. So I have to say, I think I like the colors coming out of the Sony on these examples better. And then on the sunset shot, this was the third frame from when the sun dipped below. And there is a definite difference up here in the sun. The Sony is holding a lot more detail around the sun, so it's not getting quite as blown out. Again, same exposure, same settings, same everything. But the Sony does have a lot more warmth to it, and it's holding more highlights. And we're seeing a little bit of the same thing from the other shot here. And I've always thought, looking at Sony images and videos, that the roll-offs from shadows to highlights and details are a lot softer, smoother. I'm not saying soft in a bad way, soft in a good way. And I'm seeing that here too. It's more smooth than this one. That being said, the light that's scraping across the tops in the Canon image, I do like that a little bit more. They're just different. They're different. They're both good. They're just different. So as I started getting into using the Sony a little bit more, I did notice that there's just a rotating screen on the back. It doesn't really rotate, it just kind of pops out. You can go straight up, you can go straight down, you can't come out to the side. I did really miss having that articulating screen on the Canon. No matter which way you're putting it, you can go up, down, sideways, face forward. Pretty much any direction you want to move that screen, it's there, it's good. I did miss that a lot on the Sony. A little trick here, when you go up to your viewfinder and that screen switches off, if you don't want that screen to switch off, all you have to do is pop it out ever so slightly and it disables the viewfinder. Did find that to be a little obnoxious when I had it popped out and then I put it up to shoot, wondering where's my image. But then again, it did come in handy when I had this sitting on a gimbal. Pop that screen out a little bit. As the back of the gimbal came across, it didn't cut the screen out. So that was a really nice feature to have. Then again, when I did this, a really annoying feature to have. I'm not sure where I stand on that quite yet. Sticking on the topic of screens, touchscreen. They're both touchscreen, but wait, the Sony, for whatever reason, is only like touchscreen when you focus. You can't go through the menus or change your settings using the touchscreen. You can't play using the touchscreen. It's only certain focus functions that this functions as a touchscreen. I did find that to be really obnoxious, especially coming from the Canon EOS R, where I'm used to just having that touchscreen. Boop, 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 boop. Point being, I did find the half touchscreen thing to be quite obnoxious. Go touchscreen, or don't go touchscreen. Don't make it like this works and this works, but all this other stuff, that doesn't work as a touchscreen. In rant. Now, let's move on to battery life. Both of these I found was pretty good. I don't have specifics on this. Battery lasted me 3 hours and 48 minutes, but if you're gonna head out for a day of shooting, grab an extra battery or two, no matter which one you're taking, and then you should be good for most of the day. Now, while you're grabbing batteries, grab memory cards. Dual card slots? Yes. No. End of discussion. Let's move on. If you want to shoot super slow motion, 120 frames per second, you're gonna have to shoot in 720 on the Canon EOS R. If you want to do 120 in 1080, Sony does 1080. It does actually look fairly good. Scaled up to 4K, still holds in there pretty good. Now, if you want to scale 720 up from the Canon EOS R to 4K, doesn't really hold up, I'm gotta say it. Looking at this example, it does look awful soft. Sony holds up pretty well scaling up to 4K. Canon, not so much. I also wanted to do a comparison with the image stabilizer. This has in-body image stabilization, so the sensor actually moves around and stabilizes as you're moving. As to where the Canon, it does not have IBIS or in-body image stabilization, but it does have a digital stabilizer. So let's take a look at these two examples, see which one holds up better. On this test, I was actually really impressed with the Canon. It was so much more stable than using the IBIS in the Sony. I was not expecting that because people rave about how good the in-body image stabilization is for Sony, but this one came out pretty good. Canon one came out pretty good. So digital IS, I'm sold, I'm down with it. It's good to go. But one thing you have to remember is that it does crop in a little bit. So I put lines up around here to kind of show you how much you're cropping in with each setting and stabilization and going to 4K. Now, as far as comparing 4K on both of these cameras, I think Armando and Potato Jet had a really amazing collaboration doing that, and I'm not gonna try to compare with that, so I'm gonna link their video up there. Check it out, it's a good one. Come back when you're done checking that out. Cool, you're back, let's move on. So for the comparison videos, they're all shot in C-Log on the Canon and S-Log2 on the Sony. The one thing that did really bug me about the Sony shooting S-Log2 is the minimum ISO is 800. That's a lot of ISO, especially when you're out shooting in the desert. It is hot, it is bright, it is sunny. ISO 800 is just too much. I know it's only one more stop than the ISO 400 shooting C-Log here, and I did find that to be a little bit problematic because when I do get really dark on my ND filter, I do get some vignetting on the corners. And then a couple times I was out and I did not have my ND. I had to close all the way down to f22 and it was almost still too bright. shooting at a 50th of a second, f/22, ISO 800 outside in the sun. Oh, I need like another stop. Sony, please give me another stop here. That's all I'm asking for. Now, as far as dynamic range on both of these cameras, I did a quick test that I thought had a pretty good range of really hot highlights and pretty deep dark shadows. So let's take a look at that and see which one recovers better. Now, if we take a look at these two examples here, this is the lightly edited version of each of these. This one's the Sony and this one is the Canon. You do notice a tiny bit of vignetting around the corner of the Canon. The Sony does still have vignetting, but it's a lot more spread out. And speaking of that softness, I do notice that especially in the shadowed rock back here, the Sony just looks like it has an overall softer feel to it. But what I want to focus on is this little spot of highlight right here on this rock. So as I zoom in on both of those, here's the Canon, and I want to take this down almost 4 stops. It doesn't look great, but there is still some detail there. I could tweak that and pull a nice little bit of detail out of that. Now, if I go to the Sony and drop that down to 3 1/4 stops, I think it does have a little bit more of that just blown out, unrecovered feel. Now, I'm not gonna say it's unrecoverable. It looks like it's there, but it does have a little bit of that unrecoverable look. You know what I'm talking about if you've done it yourself or seen it. So let's go back to the Canon and move down here into these trees and shadows and rock, and then bump that exposure way up. So if I bump that up about 3 stops, there's definitely still detail in there. And then if I go over to the Sony, same spot, and bump that up, definitely still detail there. So again, in the Sony, that detail is there, but it does just have that softer feel to it. But then if I go back to just the edited version, taking a look at these, I do like the Canon a little bit more. It's got a little bit more punch. It's got a little bit more pop. It's got that grab you feel to it. Both good, both quality there, but on this image, personal preference, I do like the Canon better. And then one last test that I did with this was more of a nighttime astrophotography type shot. I think this came out pretty cool, side by side, same shot, same time. Now, immediately taking a look at the edited version of this, I don't really notice a difference. As I start to look at it a little bit more, the one big difference that I do notice is the rocks in the background. They're much more white with the Canon shot, but with the Sony, they do seem to have a lot more of a green tint to them. Now they are a little bit blown out in both shots, but as I'm zoomed in looking around both of these shots, there's not a huge difference here. A little bit of a color difference in both of them, but they're both holding up very well. They're both catching the sky pretty well. They're both getting a nice pop from the Milky Way. Now I do have to say night shots sometimes can be pretty tricky. It can be hard to focus, it can be hard to frame, but I think I got this really pretty close on both of these. So to sum this up, my feelings about these two cameras, the difference between them, the Canon, it's like home. It's like being home, you know how to use it, you know where everything's at, you know which drawer that knife is gonna be in. The Sony's kind of like going out on a trip. You go into a new city, everything's different, nothing's really where you feel like it should be. You're always asking for directions and trying to look up how to get to different places. But that's just me. I've been using Canon for a very long time. I'm very comfortable with these cameras. I feel like I know where things are at in the menus. Now with the Sony, things are just labeled differently in the menus. There's a lot more options, and it just took me a lot more time to get used to it, to change the settings, and then sometimes things didn't work quite exactly as I thought they should or would or did the last time I used it. And that may also be that I just need to spend more time with this camera, getting used to it. I'm not gonna say this is a bad camera. It's good. I'm happy with everything I did with this. Am I gonna switch right away? Probably not, because I'm very used to shooting on Canon. Like I said, this is home. I'm comfortable here. I know what I'm doing. I can get the shot quickly. There were times where I pulled the Sony out and it wasn't set quite right. I needed to change something and I didn't immediately know how to get that change set up and get that shot. So I did miss a few shots with it, but totally different than shooting on the Canon. Neither one of these are bad cameras. This does things better than this one. Some of the things this one does better than this one. It's all in what you're comfortable with. If you like Sony, get a Sony. If you like Canon, stick with Canon. Anyway, that's my thoughts on using these two cameras. If you guys like this video, find it useful at all, do me a huge favor. Hit that thumbs up button down there. Hit that subscribe button down there if you haven't already, and I will see you guys next time.